Hey guys, Good Sound Club podcast episode number 6, I believe we're up to. Amazing. My name is Sina. I'm your host as always, and I have with me here today Tom. Tom, how you doing?
I'm doing pretty good.
Awesome. I think we're gonna have another freestyle episode this week. Just talk about kind of whatever comes to mind and go from there. So, what's been new with you in the audio world?
Well, I got my AlNiCo vintage speakers, and they were a really crazy deal. They were essentially $60. I mean, I've spent money in worse ways, worse restaurants, but this, I think, is probably my favorite lesson I've ever purchased in audio. Um, they have like this strange, almost like uh, carpet in front of them on the front baffle, maybe like some diffuser or dust cover, but I really like them. High frequency is kind of I would say not exaggerated, but it feels right or more so than other speakers I've heard. Um, some Danon driver silk domes, those were pretty good, but I think these little AlNiCo 1 inch tweeters are just edging them out.
What are the speakers for people who didn't catch the last episode?
Yeah, so I think they're like mid 60s, like console speakers that you help me find on eBay, and they use these AlNiCo magnet tweeters and woofers, and I don't know much about who made the drivers, but the origin says they were made in Mexico. I don't know if that's final assembly or the casting of the magnets, but they sound pretty damn good. They sound pretty damn good. I was really surprised. I have huge doubts in audio. I mean, for the most part, not just this purchase, but like how much better can things get? And these are pretty shocking. I would always imagine vintage speakers to be kind of terrible, but that must just be because I only ever heard really cheap vintage speakers, or maybe it's the magnet. I'm not really sure what it is, but I really enjoy them.
Yeah. Well, the thing about those is when when I showed them to you on eBay, I bet you were still skeptical because they kind of look like those cheap Goodwill vintage speakers, at least at first glance, right?
Yeah, they definitely do. They looked a little bit like one of your favorite pairs of speakers that I
Y-
also had huge doubts on, and now I'm pretty curious onto getting a pair of those. I don't know if
What,
you
the
want to.
Goodmans? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, yeah, the Maxims.
Why did you have doubts about those?
I mean, those are like little dinky things. They're so tiny. But when you look at the inside and you see the size of the magnet on the woofer driver, it's comical. It's almost the full length of the enclosure.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
look, the Goodman's Maxime was made for the BBC. How many speakers can attest to that?
Yeah, we talked about that a few times, like in the past, where you'd be like, the the LS35A is, good, and the reason they chose it was because, well, it was cheaper to manufacture. So I
Yeah.
have full, I fully believe you when it comes to the Goodmans.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's good. I'm really glad that you're glad. And what's the next move now that you got the speakers?
The next move, it's either gonna be upgrading them, as much as I hate saying that, or an amplifier. Source is fine for now. I mean, I'm just using my interface as a source for them. It's at my desk. I don't need a 20-pound source for my standing desk. It makes it unusable.
Mm,
Yeah, it doesn't fit my lifestyle, as I like to say. But maybe the Goodmans, they're a better size, I think, and they might actually be the right choice if I do decide to get an upgraded speaker. 'Cause now that I've heard what the magnets can do, I'm pretty confident and on the path.
awesome. All right. As for me, I guess, man, I've bought so much stuff recently, I kind of lost track. In the previous episodes, we didn't really talk about gear much, but I feel like in the past 3 weeks, I have purchased so much random stuff that Warren's talking about now, some specific equipment. So most of the purchases are because I am trying to put together um, a stereo speaker system from scratch, like the actual speakers themselves. I'm trying to DIY them because um, what I'm looking for is not really available commercially. I think I
Mhm.
talked about that a little bit in a previous episode. The types of acoustic designs I'm looking for, they're not really out there, or if they are, the prices are just whacked out, and then even then, they
Yeah.
probably would not suit
Over
my taste.
$15,000
Yeah.
probably.
So the speaker system is basically going to be uh, big boxes, probably fridge sized, somewhere between mini fridge and actual fridge sized cabinets made of real wood, or a combination of real wood and plywood. Like I might just use plywood for the sidewalls and then use real wood for the front baffle, or vice versa. I'm not sure yet because I looked up the prices of lumber here recently, and it's pretty insane to make a pair of large speakers. How much the wood costs are, but anyway, that's one thing is that I have to get the cabinets out of the way, and then the other thing is amassing the drivers. So it's going to be a multi-way speaker system. I've kind of decided for a fact that single driver speaker systems and to an extent two-way speaker systems don't really cut it for what I'm looking for. They're just maybe a little bit too um, primitive, let's say, in how they deal with different types of music. If you only listen to certain types of music, that's great. But I really listen to everything. So when I say multi-way, I mean at least three-way, but I'm thinking of even um, doing more than just three drivers per side. We'll see. So to start with, I'm looking for the mid-range driver because that's kind of the most important part. And I bought a lot of different vintage drivers from the late 50s to early 60s, so kind of the advent of stereo. And I specifically look for equipment from the advent of stereo, kind of that period between 1957 and 1964, a lot because at that time, to really convince people to start buying two of everything, people who had high-end mono systems or even consumer mono systems, and they had mono records and mono tapes and whatever, to convince them that they needed to throw that all out and buy everything again in double. The equipment had to be really good. It had to really be convincing, and there was also a kind of a arms race between the various hi-fi manufacturers in any given country, the US, the UK, Germany, um, to make kind of the best stuff and outdo each other. And this was all across the board. It was for speakers, it was for amplifiers, it was for phono cartridges, whatever. Um, and for speakers, it also kind of went beyond just doubling them, right? Because let's say you're talking about early 50s mono systems, right? Well, you could get like a big horn speaker and put it kind of in the corner of a room, and that might be acceptable in mono, but all of a sudden to do that twice, most people's living rooms can't really accommodate that sort of thing. So it also had to take into consideration how stereo speakers are meant to be placed, so they kind of all start to conform to like this smaller box form factor. But I digress. Anyway, yeah, so I started looking for drivers from that sort of time period, and the key point is cheap, because I don't really know how the final product is going to look like. So it's really important that if I'm spending money to experiment, I'm not buying like the most expensive, esoteric, exotic drivers because they might just not work at the end of the day, and I've just dumped a bunch of money into them. So I'd rather buy like 5 pairs of drivers for $100 a pair than one set of $500 speakers that have some sort of hype or collectible value. And kind of my focus has been on German made console drivers or radio drivers, again from the late 50s, early 60s. A, because they're plentiful, they made them in like very high quantities, and B, because they're really high quality. They have AlNiCo magnets, some of them have cast baskets, they have nice quality paper, and they just in general have the qualities that I'm looking for in a mid range driver.
And
So,
you have a
yeah.
lot of experience with, like, German radios, right?
Yeah, yeah. So, um, I bought a German tube radio a few years ago. I guess maybe 2019. I don't quite remember, and I don't really remember what caused me to buy it either. It was just kind of spontaneous, and that was a mono radio, but it was a big one. Like it was from 1956, so that was like the last year that they were really making mono radios, um, and it just sounded like amazing. You couldn't really play rock music or pop music on it because, it's just like a tabletop radio thing, but playing classical or jazz, kind of the sound quality it gave off was like, I want this, but bigger. So, that's why I kind of defaulted when I was started looking for mid-range drivers, not to the market today, which, a lot of them there's a couple audiophile companies like ScanSpeak and CS
CS,
from
yeah.
Denmark and stuff, and then there's a couple of pro audio companies, some from Italy, some from the States, whatever. None of those really interest me, and I just started looking at the vintage stuff instead because I knew that would give me the sound quality I wanted. Because that's what was in that Telefunken radio that I bought is like these paper cone drivers, 6 to 8 inches in diameter. Some of them are round, some of them are oval shaped. That's also a pretty popular thing in German radios is oval shaped drivers, which is really cool because it changes the dispersion characteristic of the speaker. And it also lets it play lower in frequency, despite not being that much bigger in surface area. So all of that was like really appealing to me. So yeah, that's been a lot of my purchases lately has just been drivers, and my goal is to kind of collect them and mix and match them on a sort of test baffle and see what I can get to play with what, and then once I choose something, kind of sell the rest and just move forward with that pair.
That's gonna be a stereo system, right?
Yeah, it's going to be a stereo system, but to make things easier on myself in the development phases, I'm just going to test it in mono. So I'm probably just going to build like one box or baffle for mounting the actual drivers in mono. Listen to a variety of mono recordings, piano, vocals, guitar, whatever. Uh, Sometimes in isolation, but the better drivers can actually play pretty well with like more busy recordings too. It's surprising. People kind of think of mono as like this sort of congested sound, but it doesn't have to be that way if you do it properly. So I'll be evaluating kind of the tonal qualities of the speakers, and then again how well they play with other speakers because we have to have a tweeter and a woofer too.
Yeah, I like to think that some of the stigmas against like mono, whether it's like a shellac record or some 78s or something like that, is the compensation curve not being like appropriate.
Well, yeah, it can be that. It can be if you're talking about records, it can be the compensation curve. Um, if you're actually playing the records, a lot of people, when they hear mono recordings, they're not playing the actual records. They're hearing digital remasters of them, which are not done well, or they might listen to someone's rip of one, which again, the equipment that they use to rip it is going to greatly influence that. If you're actually playing the record, the needle that you're using matters too because the groove diameters are different. So there's a lot of different factors at play, but I was going to say that the stigma against mono just really comes from a lack of experience. Like, how many people can raise their hands and say, I've heard like a proper mono hi fi system? Not many, because if they had, they'd realize kind of what it can do.
Yeah, like I think most people I know use headphones for mono systems because I mean headphones aren't technically stereo; they're kind of uh, what is the what is the word?
Binaural.
Yeah, they're binaural. They're really binaural systems that kind of trap the sound. That's why people make so many complaints about headphones. But no, I'm very interested in seeing where that goes with you. Don't you also? Do you want to talk about your other project?
What other project? The Heath Kit?
That one, yeah, the Heath
The
Kit.
Heath Kit? Okay, yeah. So I got an inexpensive Heath Kit amplifier. Heath Kit, for those of you who don't know, was a kit manufacturer or supplier, I guess. I don't really know when they started, but I know they were most active in the 50s and 60s. They might still be around. I'm not sure, and they sold audio kits. So you could literally go to a mail order catalog, look up a kit for a preamp or an amp, phone in, order it. They'd ship it to you with like a really detailed assembly manual. And if even if you were a total beginner, you'd never held a soldering iron in your life, you could build one of these things in a couple of afternoons, just like bottlehead equipment today, but even higher performance because it was back then. Um, and so just because of the kind of the volume they sold, they're still pretty available today, Heath Kit equipment, and they kind of sometimes have a stigma against them because they are again kits, so the prices are not that high. But the important thing is that the condition varies a lot, based on who built it, if they did a good job or not, um, and if they've been modified over the years. And what turned out to be the case with this one is the guy I bought it from, or his friend, or someone I don't know, did do a couple of modifications that were kind of strange to me. So I just popped the bottom cover off and I looked inside. Some of the capacitors were replaced, which is fine, but it was just kind of strange the decisions that were made. Like there is one multi-section capacitor for the power supply filtration that has four sections, and the guy who replaced them only replaced two sections. And it's not clear to me why he did that, because if he felt that it would be more reliable or whatever that way, I'm not sure why he wouldn't just do all four, but I digress. There's also a little feedback loop circuit um, where the output of the amplifier is fed back into its input, and that helps basically linearize the sound and reduce distortion. And for whatever reason, that was also modified, and I just can't figure out why. So, what I'm doing now is I just purchased a bunch of parts, resistors, caps, diodes, whatever, and my goal is to more or less return this thing to how it is on the actual Heathkit schematic. Um, the main thing that he did that disturbs me is that he left all of the coupling capacitors, the original coupling capacitors, in place, except for two of them were replaced with really expensive Mundorfs, like $100 for a pair, which is I paid just a little over four times that for the amp. So I'm not really sure why he replaced those caps in specific and why he did so with such expensive boutique capacitors. I really don't get that, but I'm going to take those out because I feel like they're kind of screwing with the tonal balance of the amp a little bit. Mundorfs generally have a bit of an exaggerated top end, and that's not what this amplifier needs at all. So I bought some um, period correct caps, let's say from the early 60s, that test good. So I'm going to put those in place of the Mundorfs. And then I'm also going to check the voltages at the other amplifying stages to make sure that there's no leakage across the remaining coupling caps, because if there is, I have to replace those as well. And then when that's all said and done, I'm going to listen to the amp again. It sounds fine as it is. I just wasn't in love with it. I knew it could be better, basically. And when I removed the bottom cover, I found out why. So when you're buying vintage gear, you have to be careful who did what to it. And there's a big reason why so many people are looking for original gear. It's not just a matter of like fetishism or whatever. It's actually because it's a lot easier to restore a piece if it matches the factory schematic than if someone's already been in there and done weird things. You have to kind of trace it and figure out what they did. So
Yeah. Makes sense to me. I mean, yeah, I look at amps online and some of them have weird things going on, like just caps in parallel that weren't there, and they just tear out the inside, remove bulbs, put in LEDs. It's weird.
yeah.
Yeah. So what's your goal besides fixing it? Is there anything you're trying to progress to? You just want to hear it just for fun?
Well, the Heath kit is actually, I've done only like very minor changes to amps before. I've never really done a full restoration myself, and I wouldn't even call this a full restoration. I'm just swapping a couple parts. But I am just curious about kind of my hypothesis if what this person did, whoever was in there before, is screwing up the sound or not. So um, I kind of just want to see where that plays out. I don't really see myself keeping that amp. It's a really nice one. What for what it is? I forgot to mention the model. It's an AA32. It's a really nice amp. It has pretty positive reputation, I guess, online. But I don't really see myself keeping it for the stereo system because I actually purchased another preamp. And the Heath kit isn't integrated, and so I want to actually use a separate preamp for the stereo system. I purchased an ACO or ICO, I guess it's ACO, HF85, which is again right from around that beginning of stereo period, 1958, and it's one of my favorite vintage stereo preamps. I just really like it a lot. So I found one in mint condition, and I bought it. So that's what I'm going to be using instead of the Heath kit. Power amplifier, I have no clue yet. We'll have to find out. What was the other project? You said other project. I don't know
Oh,
what you're
you have
referring to.
2. You have 2 projects. You have 2 projects.
I have
2 other
50 projects.
projects. You have many projects. You
Yeah,
know, if anyone really knows, you, they know you have many, many, many projects. You know, some weekends you just pick up some stuff and,
that's a
so
project.
there's your other, speaker system that you're working on
Mhm.
with the old, I think, RCA, console, I think. Is it a
Oh,
console?
yeah, yeah, the RCA radio. So um well, really back to that Telefunken radio that I purchased from 1956. When I heard that, that was also the eye opener for me of how good mono can sound because, like I said, that was a mono radio, even though it had 6 speakers in it. They just did that to kind of, um, improve its ability to fill a room better.
SPL.
Um Sorry?
For the SPL to
Yeah, for the SPL,
move more
exactly, the
air.
dispersion. But that was kinda I was like, "I want this exact sound, but bigger." So, I started doing some research, and I started looking into other Telefunken speakers, possibly older. I ended up finding a gentleman from the Czech Republic who was, kind of a dealer of, I guess, vintage equipment. He was kinda specialized in just vintage stuff and dealing it out, and he's now semi-retired, he's kinda moved on, but these, speakers that I bought from him were from his own personal system, so he was actually using these daily. And what it is, one of them is a 12-inch, Telefunken field coil driver from 1938, and then it also has a little matching tweeter, that I guess was not made by Telefunken, but was made by, Siemens, I guess, from roughly the same year, 38 or 37. And it's just a little 5-inch paper tweeter. Doesn't extend very high, maybe 10 kilohertz of extension for the whole system, but when you're playing mono recordings of a certain period, that's all you really need. And so, okay, I have these like really crazy overbuilt drivers from like 100 years ago. I needed a box to put them in. And I figured the easiest thing I could do was to just, buy a radio cabinet from that era that was suitable, that had like the correct dimensions, and just swap the drivers out. So that's exactly what I did. I found someone selling an RCA radio from 1936 basically for free because no one wanted it. Cosmetically, it was a little rough, but surprisingly, it actually worked perfectly. And the guy said it had been in his family for many years. So I went and I picked that up. I gutted it. I took the amplifier out. I took the original RCA speaker out, which is nowhere near the quality of the Telefunken driver I'm going to put in there. Um, and I cleaned out all the cobwebs because it was very dusty and dirty. And now I'm just kind of in the process of thinking how to best fit these speakers into this cabinet because the 12-inch one goes in place of the native speaker really easily. It's just a drop-in replacement. It fits perfectly. But this radio never had a tweeter. So I'm trying to figure out what's the best place to put the tweeter. Um, and basically, yeah, clean it up and kind of make it into a mono speaker because I really want that sound I got from that Telefunken radio, but like I said, but bigger. So
Turn it up.
this RCA radio, by the way, is the size of a fridge. It's yeah, it's pretty big.
Yeah, definitely designed in a different era. I couldn't imagine buying a Bluetooth speaker that big. I know there's
Yeah.
some, but I can't imagine
Well,
they'd be even the same kind of quality.
actually, you know what? That's what a lot of people do is they buy old radios from the 30s and 40s and they just modify them to take like input from a little Bluetooth board, a
Hmm.
little Bluetooth DAC board, and then they just play music to them from their phone.
Yeah, I was told by a friend that an amp builder, he does that. Like that's the best Bluetooth speaker he's ever heard, and it's like some DIY project where he just, put the drivers in, put the amplifier in, and it just works. It just makes music.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
And they're very, very beautiful cabinets too. Like these
yeah,
old radio cabinets, you can't get stuff like that today. It doesn't matter how much money you pay. There's no one making stuff of that quality.
yeah, and I'm sure they're not made out of MDF either.
No, it's all real wood.
Nice, nice. So what do you expect to be able to hear that? What's what's
Uh,
what's the
that's a good
timeline look
question.
like?
So Yeah, a couple things have to come together. So, like I mentioned, the Telefunken drivers that are going in there are field coil drivers. So, for anyone not familiar, a field coil driver, before kind of permanent magnets on speakers became, let's say, cost efficient enough to do, or small enough really to do for commercial applications, speakers didn't have magnets on them. They had coils, right, which is really just a wire wrapped around some sort of magnetic core, and you had to energize the coil by applying a voltage to it. So basically, a radio from that time had two amplifiers in it, or two power supplies, one for the actual amp, the normal amp that the radio signal goes through, and then another one just to power the coil on the speaker. So the problem today is that no one really makes, you can't just go out and
Hmm.
buy a field coil power supply from anywhere. It's not really a thing. There are some like super boutique outfits that make them, but in the high end sphere, I mean, but I'm not going to pay for one of those. So I basically either have to DIY or find someone to make one for me. The good news is they're not that complicated. Really, what it is it's just a transformer, a power transformer, like normal, that takes the voltage from your wall and steps it up to what you need. A rectifier, because you got to get it from AC to DC, and then some filtering, so just like a capacitor to smooth out the ripple. So it's really just three components. But the thing is that with a field coil speaker, the quality of the power supply is as influential on the sound as the actual amp itself. It's like they're one to one in terms of influence. So there's a lot of people out there who buy. I don't want to say a lot of people. There's some people out there who buy these old field coil drivers and they just test them like with car batteries, because car batteries happen to supply the correct voltage a lot of the times. But that doesn't sound very good, as you might imagine. So yeah, that's something I have to get done. I have to fit the drivers to the actual radio cabinet now that it's been kind of cleaned and excavated, and then I need my mono amplifier, which is I ordered a single-ended 2A3 amplifier, I guess a year ago now, from a gentleman in Ukraine, and he's been building it for me. Um, and the reason why the lead time is so crazy long is because everything is kind of done super esoteric from scratch by hand. Like he's winding all the transformers himself and really crazy stuff. You've seen some pictures.
Yeah.
It's wild. So I need that amplifier to be done. It's 99% done. I actually just got a text from him yesterday with some photos of it working, which is really exciting. Um, and he's just doing like some final sound tuning to it. So, got to get the amp, got to get the field coil supply, and then I got to actually put the speakers into the cabinet. So maybe, I don't know, 2 or 3 more months, I would guess.
Hmm.
But yeah, I'm super looking forward to that and seeing how that turns out.
Wow, what a freaking journey! Can't wait to read what
Yeah.
you what it sounds like. I mean, it's just like I'm just trying to wrap my head around it. Do you want to talk about any of the crazy techniques that are being applied in an amplifier?
Yeah, well, it's a really unconventional amp in every sense of the word. There's like so many crazy techniques, I don't even know where to begin. The first one is really interesting. So I actually, when I ordered this amplifier, one of the good things that I did is I talked to him exactly about what type of system I'd be using it in. I told him that I'd be using these specific Telefunken drivers. They'd be in a two-way configuration. They're field coils, blah blah blah. And he's familiar with them. He's owned these speakers too, so he knows. And what he did is he put a separate output transformer. So normally a single-ended tube amp, for each channel, it just has one output transformer, which allows the output tube, in this case the 2A3, to interface with the speaker and get the right impedance match. He put a separate, smaller output transformer just for the tweeter. So this way, I can hook up the amp with one set of wires to the main driver, the woofer, and then another set of wires to the tweeter. And I've read about this before. It's not really a common thing that people do, but apparently um, it's really good for the sound. That's what I hear anyway, that it has all sorts of benefits. So that's one thing that's kind of unconventional.
So
Uh,
so what does that
yeah.
really do? Is that like a dampening factor thing? Like is what's the different windings for the tweeter?
Oh, okay. Well, for the first thing is that you no longer need to have a
Crossover?
capacitor between the output transformer and the tweeter, because normally I would have to put a capacitor to kind of roll off the low frequencies of the tweeter where I wanted to cross it over, right?
Hmm.
But now that's being done inside the amp before this little second output transformer. The second thing is that he can kind of optimize the output transformer by winding it, just like you said, with a different ratio. Because I think I'm not 100% sure that this tweeter has a different impedance than the woofer. I think it's 16 ohms versus the 4 of the woofer, if I'm not mistaken. So that also lets him do a separate, winding on this second output transformer that's specially for the tweeter. And then the third thing, it's esoteric. I think there's no reason on paper why this would necessarily sound better, but from people who have tried it, and there's very few, I've run across this on the internet maybe a grand total of 2 times. Um, they say that it really does make a profound difference to the sound in terms of kind of intelligibility and stuff like that. So yeah, it's really interesting.
Wow. So let's move back from the output of the amp. What else is on the inside?
Yeah, so there's going to be two inputs. One is a conventional direct input, straight to the grid of the input tube, and the second has actually an input transformer on it. And this input transformer has a really small step-up ratio. I think it's like 1 to 1.5, so not very much at all. But this is going to allow me to connect a digital source like a CD player or a DAC directly to this kind of two-stage amp and get the sufficient drive that is needed to basically get a satisfying output from the amp. It's not really a matter of volume, it's more a matter of just having um,
It's the voltage
the
then.
right drive, I guess is how I would describe it. There's a reason why, for instance, some people tend to prefer active preamps versus passive ones, even though their system doesn't need extra gain. And it's usually just comes down to a matter of
Hmm.
drive. So that's what this input transformer is doing. In the case of a vinyl source, because I am going to have a turntable hooked up in this system, I will be using a separate preamp. I still do need to get the right, equalization and gain for a phono cartridge. But for a digital source, I'm really happy to have this kind of step up transformer to boost the signal before it gets to the first vacuum tube. And then well, not the last thing, but one of the last things is the power supply. So this unit it's a mono amp, right? So there's only one driver tube, there's only one output tube, and you would expect there to only be one rectifier tube, but there's actually two. So there's two rectifier tubes because the driver tube and the output tube each get one. And
Oh,
this is
wow.
not something that I've ever seen before. I have seen amps that have two rectifiers, but usually they're stereo amps, and the reason they have two is because there's one per channel, so it's like a dual mono power supply. In this case, we're only talking about one channel, but each section, input and output, gets its own rectifier, which is really crazy. I've never seen that before. And again, I have no idea what it's going to do for the sound until I actually hear it, but um, and it's going to make tube rolling a lot more painful potentially, but we'll see. Kind of.
Oh, I mean, I don't think you would have to match them. Probably,
No, you don't have to match them, but yeah,
peace
I
of
mean, yeah,
mind.
you're
You
right.
mean for peace of mind? Like,
Yeah,
do I want this one here or this one there? And
that's exactly what I mean. Yeah.
like, not wanting to buy more tubes just to roll them. That's so tell me a little bit about the overall design. I know it follows some principles. Maybe it's I think it's EMI. Is that him? EML? EML, right?
Oh no, AML. You mean?
AML. Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah, this guy who's building the amp kind of comes from like a certain, I guess you could say, school of thought. Um, the reason I picked the 2A3 output tube isn't because of any special reason. I just happen to like it. Just not even necessarily the sound of it, but more like the concept of it. So this tube was developed kind of during the audio boom in the U.S. right in the mid 30s.
The
Um,
2A3.
the 2A3, yeah, the 2A3 output tube. And the earliest examples of it are actually really similar to the preceding 45, which a lot of people also love. I'm not necessarily crazy about the 45, but I really love the early 2A3s. The early 2A3s are kind of like the big boy version of a 45. They look very similar in construction. They're just kind of bigger. They kind of dwarf the 45 in both appearance and, in my opinion, in sound. Um, and it's kind of the epitome of like that classic American sound, which I really love. And for people who are super deep into tube stuff, or really any vintage equipment, they'll know that kind of each region of the world, whether it's Germany or the US or Britain, those are kind of the big three, but there's other ones too, have like their own kind of flavor or idea of concept of sound, right? And I really personally identify with the American one. I just like that kind of bright, convex, dynamic sound. Um, and the 2A3 is kind of like the epitome of that. And then in terms of kind of the rest of the amp, I just left it up to him. I said, "Hey, look, I want to use American tubes because I think they're cool, and also I live in Canada, so it's easier for me to find American tubes here than if I was in the EU, for instance. I'd probably be looking more at Soviet or German tubes, or maybe even British. But 283s can still be found here because they were used in radios here, right? Um, and I left the rest up to him because that's really what you got to do when you work with someone who's building you a custom amp. You shouldn't tell them, I want this, this, and this. You should just say, I plan to use it in this and this way with these speakers. These are my listening tastes. I need these features, volume control, inputs, whatever, and then let the builder do the rest. Because if you don't kind of have that trust and you try to dictate which way it goes from the beginning, you're probably going to end up both being disappointed with the outcome. So that was really important to me that he kind of just did his thing when it came to building the amp, and he just gave me periodic updates, and that's it.
It's pretty cool. Now, does the overall layout influence the sound of the amplifier? Like,
What do you mean by the layout? The circuit?
yeah, the circuit, the dimensions. Let's see, how do I say this? Like where the input is, where the output is, where the transformers
Oh,
are.
okay. Yeah, it can. So when we're talking about circuits, circuits are really just like ideas, right? They're just
Mm-hmm.
like theories, and there's a million good ones. But the actual execution of it, like what parts you use where, and stuff like that, that's what really identifies the sound. Now, the reason I went for a two-stage amp rather than a three-stage, actually, I left that decision mostly up to him as well. But I knew that with a phono source, I was going to be using a separate preamp that had a good amount of gain itself. Specifically, I'm using one from the early 50s because it has all the different equalizations built in. So if I want to listen to records from the 30s versus the 40s versus the 50s from different countries, I can always get the correct equalization dialed in. That's pretty important for me because that's the whole point of this system is to listen to historical recordings, right? So since I knew the preamp was going to have a good amount of gain, I didn't want to go with a three-stage amp. I also knew that the speakers, it was just going to be a two-way system and not necessarily need to fill like a huge space like a horn system might. So there was just no need for me to go three-stage. I was concerned about digital sources, how those would work without a preamp. And that's when he came up with the idea of kind of having the input transformer to help a little bit without adding a whole nother tube stage. Because when you add a whole nother active stage, you're not just talking about one tube, right? You're talking about how to get power to that tube. You're talking about how to connect that tube to the other stages with other passive components. So it becomes like a whole balancing act. It really complicates the dish, so to speak.
Yeah, and,
Um,
and that way I assume it's just a switch and a transformer.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It's gonna be an input switch. The other benefit of the transformer too, which is great, a lot of people don't know this, transformers are inherently differential. So that means that, they can be used for summing. They can be used to sum, for example, balance circuits to single-ended. They can also be used to sum a stereo signal to a mono one. So most well, all CD players output stereo signals, right? And to get them into a mono amp, you have to either just listen to one channel, which is acceptable. Some people do that, but you will like lose some information, obviously, or you have to sum it. And there's a variety of ways to sum it. You can use like a little resistor network, but probably the best way to sum it is through a transformer. So that's the other great thing is that I can connect the CD player right up to that transformer, use both outputs of the CD player, and then it's just going to be like a mono signal. And then how good something is, that kind of depends on the recording, how it was made, the aesthetic of it, that type of thing. But it is generally better than just listening to one channel.
Hmm. So when you sum them, I assume that combines both the voltages of the left and right channel.
Yes. Yeah, so it's like a voltage. If you do it with resistors, it's like a voltage dividing network. So the way that it works is one channel kind of becomes like the lead. It's more prominent, and the other channel gets blended into it, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Um, in terms of which channel you should do that with, I don't know. It's kind of difficult to say. I think most people usually pick the right channel as the dominant one, but it doesn't really matter too much, I think. Especially if you're listening to early stereo recordings that are like super hard panned, then it
Yeah.
really doesn't matter.
Yeah. Well, that's super awesome. That's a lot to go into an amplifier. I mean, not a lot of parts, but I mean, like that's a lot of thought. That's a lot of thought.
Yeah, well, um, this is something I'm planning to keep for life because now it's kind of been personalized for me, like my taste, not just my taste sonically, but also my use case, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this guy on the other end, he's kind of going and kind of putting blood, sweat, and tears into this thing. We're not just building something from a diagram and trying to execute it like a kit. I mean, we're actually making something up from scratch and conceptualizing it and then executing it. Well, he's doing most of the work. I'm just sitting here financing it, but it's going to be awesome when it's done.
Yeah, I might have to go hear that sometime. Anything else you want to talk about? You've talked about the mono amp, the mono system, the stereo repair you're doing. For your workshop. Uh, talked about. I've talked about my AlNiCo speaker hunt now.
Hmm.
What's next? Do you want to just go into music?
No, there's two. I guess there's two more things I can touch on.
Okay.
Yeah, the workshop. So I've been putting this off forever, but I finally just decided to set up like a dedicated space in my basement where I can put a workbench, which I have, and just work on gear. Because when you own as much vintage stuff as I do, 70% of it is broken or at least somewhat non-functional. So it's necessary to repair stuff. And I've kind of learned the hard way that there is no one out there. Like there are still some good techs around, but the reality is there's no one out there that's going to do something as good for you as they would do it for themselves. So you really have to fix stuff yourself. Like, yeah, you can give like a receiver to like a tech, and he can go through and replace all the capacitors and say, "Here's your receiver back." The problem with that a lot of the time is that the receiver is not going to sound the same when you get it back. But I digress. The point is that if you want quality work, really, you have to do it yourself. And so I am setting up that workshop space so that whenever I'm faced with a piece of equipment that I know needs some care, it needs some parts replaced, it needs some work done to it, I'm just going to literally take the time and do it myself, because I have been burned before, I guess, trusting others to kind of do that work for me. And now I realize that you got to do it yourself. So
Yeah,
that's one thing that I'm excited about. The other thing is I kind of have to learn woodworking a little bit for multiple projects. Number one, the speaker projects, because I got to build cabinets for them. But beyond just that, I don't want to just like shape wood into a certain dimensions or whatever and glue it together. Yeah, that's pretty easy. I guess anyone can do that. But I'm trying to also figure out how to make it sound good, because when you're talking about cabinets, um, you can't just kind of stick some plywood boards together and expect them to sound good. Wood has its own resonant properties. It's a living, breathing thing. At least real wood is. MDF not so much, and plywood a little bit more, but still not so much because it's kind of been treated and pressed together and all that. But what I'm getting at is I'm learning how to finish wood, not just to make it look good, but also make it sound good. Um, and a big source of inspiration for that is not really reading about other people's DIY speaker experiences, but instead reading about instrument building and kind of the luthier work and what goes into kind of treating a guitar or a violin wood to make it sound good. So I'm kind of been reading up on that and trying to see how I can apply those concepts to audio.
I really gotta make that cabinet sing.
Yeah, exactly. The cabinet, if it's a good cabinet, it literally will sing. It'll enhance the sound of whatever speakers are in it. If it's a poor cabinet, it will hold them back and it'll kind of just have a dead sound. And I've already had that experience of trying to put together cabinets without properly treating them and being disappointed in the sound. And at the time, I had no idea why, but now I realize it's because the cabinet, or the wood rather, was just it was untreated. It was naked, and so it wasn't. It was never going to sound good.
Yeah, naked wood, MDF, LDF, HDF. There's a lot to really think about. Not just like the materials, but also the construction, right? So, are you just gonna have a front baffle? Is it gonna be like an open baffle thing? Are you gonna have like some acoustic resistance thing? I know you've thrown a lot of ideas my way, but have you decided what you think it might look like? I know you got to
Yeah,
hear it first, but
for the speakers. So the top section of the speakers, and by top section I mean like the mid range and the high frequency. It's going to be an open backed box. So actually, really similar to the speakers that you purchased, right? For the
hmm
Magnavox speakers, they're an open back box. So mine are going to be the same thing, just like an old radio, because that's how a lot of these old drivers work best, is in an open back box. And then for the low frequencies, I'm really not sure yet because I haven't purchased any of the woofers yet. So far, I've only bought the mid range and the tweeters. So it kind of depends on what woofer I get and what its parameters are. If it works better in like a vented enclosure, or if it also should be in an open back box, I don't know yet. That's kind of the part that I know the least about, and I'm kind of dreading, but I have to figure it out one way or another. It's probably going to involve actually having to read some books to kind of figure it out because, um, the mid range and the high frequencies kind of easy. You can kind of just put them on a baffle together and mess with the positioning and try different value capacitors to cross them over and then get somewhat of a good results. But the bass, which is really like the foundation of the entire sound, that's the really tricky part to kind of pull off. Where to cross that woofer over, um, and messing around with inductors, which are what you need to do a low pass filter for a woofer, right, is not as convenient as messing around with capacitors is. So all in all, I'm not really looking forward to that, but that's the part that I have to figure out.
nice. That's super cool. Um, yeah. So I think from there, we've talked about upcoming projects. Do I have any upcoming projects? I don't know. I always have this streamer project, but that's so far away. All the parts I want to get are they're kind of esoteric too. I mean, I don't want to spoil too much, but most of them are like, I guess technically military grade. There's just a military specification for electronics. So they're suitable for airplanes, submarines, planes, giant ships, whatever it is. But I haven't been able to find appropriate power supplies that I would think that would be able to justify the price. The price I'm looking at is way too much. Like I don't think it'd be commercially viable. But yeah, I tend to stay more on the tech side. But I always like hearing about your woodworking projects, your amp projects. Whether it's researching violin finishes or talking about paper and oil capacitors. So
Yeah.
yeah, so I think we can move on to the sounds or the music section, which, if you think about it, that's kind of why we're always here. I mean, this is my favorite section just because I really enjoy music and the gear's good and I love getting new gear, but sometimes you hear a new song or an old song for the first time and you go, "What? I didn't know this was possible." So, my track is Frank Zappa, Muffin Man. Man, I'm a really big Frank Zappa fan. I don't like everything. I don't want to say big. I would just say I'm an average Frank Zappa fan. No,
Okay.
no.
You're a
I'm a
Frank
below
Zappa
average.
enjoyer.
I'm an enjoyer. I'm an enjoyer. Yeah, I'm a Frank Zappa enjoyer. Some songs I cannot enjoy. It's some of them are too creepy, but I understand its purpose. But this one is Muffin Man. I don't know what it's about, man. I think he's just rocking out. Typical Frank Zappa, 1977. He's just rocking out on the paired album, which I believe is Bongo Fury with Captain Beefheart. I've liked some Captain Beefheart. I didn't know he ever did anything with Frank Zappa, but I should have known that really if I was a bigger fan. But I'm not gatekeeping myself here. He's just there on stage, rocking out without a shirt, playing the guitar. That's that's about
Is
it.
it fusion or prog or what is it? I'm not familiar with Zappa.
Frank Zappa, I would just say jazz, just to keep it short, but he's
Okay.
fusion, prog, jazz, like acapella. Like he just makes music he loves, and that's what I like about Zappa. He's not. I don't know. I don't think he was ever the kind of person to want to sell out. I think he was a person who loved the craft, and he just wanted to make music. And he has amazing, amazing band. Like the bands they're called the Mothers of Invention, and the first album I heard of them was One Size Fits All by Frank Zappa. Absolutely love that whole album. I think Steve Guttenberg recommended a video once, and I think it was called Inca Roads. Wow, what a
Hmm.
crazy song! It was on some Eagle YouTube channel. I forget. They changed their name twice since I've known it, but yeah, I'm a huge Frank Zappa fan, and he's just rocking out, playing the guitar.
Cool.
Yeah. What about you? I know you listen to a lot of music this week.
Yeah, well, the choice for this week is super easy. It's the new Big Thief album.
Oh, yes, yes.
Has a funny name, Dragon New Warm Mountain, I Believe in You. It's a double LP, so it's like, yeah, shit, it's an hour and 20 minutes long, 20 songs. But the songs all range from very good to like mind blowing. Um, I was never really crazy about Big Thief before. Like, I knew they were an indie rock band. I knew they were good. I knew they were on top of the indie rock charts or indie folk, whatever you want to call it. I don't care. But I never really sat down to listen to any of their albums. I kind of just picked songs. But this one, because just the recommendation engine on Tidal, every time they released a new single off this album was recommending it to me. Same thing on YouTube, just because I listen to a lot of similar artists. So I was listening to every single they were coming out, and each one was better than the last. And then finally the album dropped, and it was like 20 songs with the same quality as the singles. And I was like, wow, mind blown. So it's really, really good. I super regret not getting tickets to see them because they're coming to Toronto, and I've looked at resale tickets, and they're now like $400. So
Oof.
I'm probably not going to see them this year. But yeah, if you haven't checked out the new Big Thief album, check it out. It's I don't know what you would call it. I guess it is really just indie rock, but it's not. I mean, that's yeah.
I mean, they
It's
have
it's
guitars and they sing and they
They have
support this.
guitars, they sing. There's folk undertones. The front woman is an amazing, amazing songwriter, like super, super talented. That's why there's 20 songs on this album, is because she just churns them out apparently. Um,
A real
and
artist.
yeah, I think the song that I'm gonna pick off this one is Red Moon. I think. It was a video. It was a video of them, the band, like in this tiny closet, all sitting in a circle with the cameraman in the middle, like panning around, playing like a stripped down version of this song. So that's the one we'll link for the podcast.
Nice. Well, I think that does it.
All right, thank you guys. See you again later, maybe next week, week
Catch you all.
after. Who knows? Bye.